Former British Prime Minister and current Foreign Secretary David Cameron is pressing American lawmakers to pass additional funding for Ukraine, saying that Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin could be back for more if his war is successful. Meanwhile, Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko made a shocking comparison in a new interview, likening Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. He said, quote, "At some point, we will no longer be any different from Russia, where everything depends on the whim of one man." Klitschko, who has served as the mayor of Kyiv since 2014, has commended other Ukrainian mayors and governors for halting Ukraine's transition into authoritarianism.
Journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote on X, "If anyone pointed this out until about 2 weeks ago, they'd instantly be branded as a Kremlin agent. Many of us were officially proclaimed to be that. Now that everyone, even in Ukraine, is turning on Zelensky, everything is fair game, including admitting the war effort failed." So I don't know how much I agree with what Glenn Greenwald is saying there. I think there were enough people that are deemed realist in the foreign policy think space that were very critical of the United States supporting Ukraine with, money to fight off Russia. It was an if you give a mouse a cookie situation. We gave them some money for defense. Zelensky kept asking for more and more and more, and we really saw the situation within Ukraine crumble. We saw intense corruption. We saw leaders of the Azov battalion get promoted into leadership positions, and you wonder what kind of country we're leaving behind when we're supporting a war that is, many believe, unwinnable for Ukraine. And when you have such widespread claims of corruption from within Zelensky's administration, you have to question what we're supporting here. Is this going to be a country worth having when it's all said and done? When do we draw lines in the sand and say, okay, we have to find a way to move forward without the United States dumping tons of dollars into this? And so we're in a pretty tough situation now. I think, Glenn Greenwald might be exaggerating there, but I do think that now there are more people getting real about the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think the sort of more people being willing to speak out probably has a good bit to do with public polling that shows the American people's sort of enthusiasm or desire to continue supporting Ukraine has waned significantly as this has gone on, right? And I think part of the problem and why there's not that much support among the American people and why people are speaking out against it more is just because of the way this whole thing started, right? I mean, if you look at it going back what seems like ancient political history by now, but the Biden administration was spending months and actually wasting months trying to work with the Chinese government to try to talk Putin out of invading. We saw all the satellite pictures of Russia's troops amassing at the border with Ukraine, and Joe Biden was saying, don't do this. You had the White House and the State Department saying, we're doing all these things to try to deter Russia, and this will work, and this will save Ukraine. And then obviously none of those efforts worked, and you had Russia invade Ukraine anyway. And now it's been how many ever, months on months on months, more than a year of this, coming up on 2 years, not that far away even, actually. And Joe Biden never really communicated to the American people what we were doing there. He never said, why we have to do this. He never necessarily said anything other than we have to stop Putin. And in that one off-the-cuff ad-libbed remark that gave everyone in the West Wing heartburn, he said, Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. A statement that the White House then had to very quickly walk back, saying it's actually not the U.S. position that we're calling for regime change in Russia. And so I feel like the government's handling of all this has been done very poorly, like a lot of the Biden administration's foreign policy has been. And so when you don't have that buy-in from the American people, even if there was some initially just because of, for lack of a better term, the excitement about what was happening in Ukraine, but there's just not really been anything to explain to the American people what they're getting for all of this aid that we're giving. And Biden's speech, even I believe it was just yesterday, he talked about this, or 2 days ago maybe now, where he said, if you don't pass a new funding bill to continue funding aid to Ukraine, the aid will run out, and the next thing that happens will be American soldiers fighting Russian soldiers. And so to go make that leap all of a sudden, that's basically, if you don't give me more money to give to Ukraine, your kids are going to go off to war and be fighting the Russians, just kind of typified how poorly this has been handled by the Biden administration.
Yeah, absolutely. The sanctions absolutely backfired initially with the United States dealing with discontent over the price of gas immediately, even when nightly news was just a repeat of Ukrainian family interviews about how horrific the war was, and really garnering support among the American people to justify congressional spending for the war in Ukraine. You had now, some almost 2 years later, the Pentagon failing an audit. A year and a half later, it's 6th audit in a row. That is huge. People aren't going to want to give more money to the Defense Department if they can't even track where it's going. Then the attempted allocation of more funding directly to Israel and to Ukraine, I think, has gotten a lot of pushback from conservatives, interestingly. But the anti-war movement, I think, in the United States is growing. The anti-U.S. intervention movement is absolutely growing. But the desire to keep U.S. dollars within U.S. borders is huge. We had the Senate on Wednesday shoot down a $14 billion package to Israel to restock their missile systems. We all see on the Al Jazeera live feed what those missiles are doing. Partially, it's the Iron Dome, but we've also seen the carpet bombing of Gaza. I think we're in a time where people are just sick of seeing the United States spend money on this. $14 billion to Israel when it would cost $20 billion to end homelessness in the United States, according to HUD. These are insane statistics. And it's true what Martin Luther King Jr. once said, that your budget is a moral document. It speaks to your values and your priorities. And frankly, I think people are turning on Ukraine simply because they're skeptical of U.S. intervention finally.
Yeah, and I think it seems like everything that's come out of the senators who have been part of the negotiations with the Biden administration on that funding bill that you discussed that was shot down on Wednesday, a procedural vote that would have advanced that in the Senate, it sounds like the Biden administration has not been taking seriously at all the concern of Republican senators, and even from accounts some Democrat senators who have said, Joe Biden, you do not understand how absolutely enraged these senators are, because the people back in their states are so enraged that you continue to send this money to Ukraine and other countries while the border is wide open. Like you said, homelessness. Like, look at New York. I mean, New York is pleading for more money because they, even though they already have significant, sort of social support and welfare programs, can't handle this anymore. And Joe Biden is just seemingly, at least him or his administration, whoever's pulling the levers and making the decisions, does not seem to understand that the American people are actually very, very upset about this. And it's not something that's just, Republican senators that Joe Biden will call extreme. When he says that they're being extreme for saying we should secure the border and address domestic things if we're going to also continue sending aid abroad, he's calling every American that believes that extreme. And that just shows how completely out of touch he is. And I think that is going to end up being potentially what costs him so much in 2024 if he ends up actually being on the ballot next November, is he is not only calling Republicans extreme, he's just calling anybody who disagrees with him at this point extreme. And that's a very bad corner to paint yourself into when the American people have completely soured on your handling of the economy, of national security, of border security, of immigration, of foreign policy, international relations. He has put himself in a situation where he cannot possibly admit that he was wrong or make a compromise, because he's gone so hard in the paint by calling everybody who disagrees with him extreme that I don't think there's any way for him to walk that back.
By supporting solving this conflict through war, the United States has definitely alienated itself from the international community. When we think about the United Nations Resolution 242, that drew maps in the Levant Basin for what was delineated as the Israeli state and what was delineated as land for the Palestinian people, it was very obvious that this first task of the United Nations, this international organization that was founded to prevent wars, was impossible. It was obvious the way this map was drawn, it wouldn't work. Similarly, in the post-World War II and Cold War era, a lot of the maps drawn and the borders drawn between Ukraine and Russia and the way the former Soviet Union dissolved, it was complicated. It was obvious that there were pockets of land in Ukraine that were largely populated by people who identified as Russians. They were mostly speaking Russian. They didn't identify with Ukrainians. And it's absolutely awful that the United States has not been a force in resolving these conflicts through diplomacy. To support the Netanyahu regime in Israel, and say that this person that very clearly doesn't want peace is someone that you support is an absurd policy position for this administration to take. It's one that former administrations have refused to take, that Jimmy Carter was incredibly critical of. Similarly, to say, we just stand with Ukraine because we're enemies of Putin and we can solve this war as well, just as the one in Israel with weapons and destruction and over 100,000 civilian casualties. It's insane. It's an absurd approach for the United States to take that's supposed to be, a bastion of peace and order in the world. It's just not what the international community is getting from the U.S. right now, and it puts all of us, I think, at risk.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The sort of rising fear that I think a lot of Americans are feeling amid all of this stuff. And you even had earlier this week the FBI director, Christopher Wray, testifying on Capitol Hill, saying that all of the warning lights are blinking red. And that's not the first time he said something like that. He said this is probably the most dangerous situation the United States, the homeland, our security situation has been since probably after September 11th, or more recently when ISIS, was rising to power in the Middle East. And you look at what the Biden administration has done, like you were just mentioning, with our investments in foreign situations. Not only are we arming and sending aid money to countries like Israel and Ukraine, but you have him sending 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to the region. You have him, again, his attempt to deter things has not ever really worked, right? He was unsuccessful in convincing the Taliban not to take over Afghanistan and institute this extreme government that has no rights for women and other minorities. He was unable to convince China or Putin directly to not invade Ukraine. He was unable to do anything, to get the Iranians to stop attacking U.S. troops in the Middle East. And it just seems like no matter what he does, things keep getting worse and things keep getting less safe for Americans, both at home and abroad. And that's something that we will definitely be talking more about. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.